Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. So, North Dakota's oil industry, you can't really talk about the governance of our state, regardless of what policy you're talking about, education policy, tax policy, whatever. It all touches on our energy industry. And primarily when you talk about the oil energy industry, you're talking about oil and gas. Coal's obviously very important as well. It drives so much. So much of our state's revenues come from our taxes on that activity, both directly when we're talking about something like oil production and extraction taxes, or indirectly when you talk about the amount of, say, sales tax revenue that the oil industry drives, or the amount of income tax revenue that the oil industry drives. The industry is central to our state for good and bad, and the only thing I say bad about it is it's a commodity industry, and that means sometimes we get some ups and downs, and those are hard to predict. But recently, Ron Ness, who is the president of the North Dakota Petroleum Council, that's the organization that represents the oil industry in our state, the oil and gas industry. Recently, he had an op-ed in the papers talking about how the future of the industry is bright. And I wanted to have him on to talk about that because sometimes, Ron, that's not what we hear. And even in the context when we're talking about policy, and I do think that this is appropriate when our policymakers are talking about how, oil is a one-time harvest. It's not going to last forever. One day we're going to be beyond this. I mean, sometimes that can connotate as the feeling that, I don't know, like there's an end to the good times looming or something like that, which I don't think is their intent. I think it's just more of a, let's make sure we're making good long-term policy. But even in the context of, the climate change debate and everything, when you hear a lot of people talking about how we're gonna stop using oil, we're gonna stop using gas, but you're saying the future's bright. So explain, what does that mean?
Well, Rob, first of all, thank you for the invite today, and it's especially great to see my old friend Ben Hanson, who, by the way, grew up and his grandfather was a key component of the of all of these discussions back in the day when in his local and legislative experience. So, why I say future is bright, because the future is bright. And the future is all about technology. As we have got this incredible resource in North Dakota. It's a world-class resource. There are very few like it in the world. And, for 60 years, we drilled right through it. We just did not have the technology and how to get the oil out of the individual Bakken and now Three Forks petroleum system, which is shale. The oil that had migrated out of the Bakken up into the Mission Canyon into some of the other formations was conventional rock. We knew how to drill that. We started producing out of that rock in 1951. And we did that for a long, long time until the technology came along to really drill down 2 miles, then go horizontal for 2 miles. Now in this past year, we've gone 3 miles. Yesterday, I talked to a producer. They're talking about going 4 miles out. So 2 miles down, 4 miles out, 3 miles out has changed the game again in the Bakken. It's made all that much more economic. It's all about economic connectivity to that rock and that tightly held oil in that shale, and then the ability to stimulate that oil out of that rock with microseismic fractures into that shale to allow the oil to flow into the wellbore. So it's really a function of, out of every 100 barrels of oil in the Bakken, starting out in 2007, 2008, 2010, we got 1 or 2 of those barrels. Today, 13 years, 15 years later, with the best technology in the world, we're getting 15 or 16 of them. So how do we get the next 10, the next 15? 1 more barrel, 1% more recovery is 1 billion barrels of oil. So we've got to continue to invest in technology. We've got to continue to provide the right state and federal and local climate to attract the investment, because as you move along these plays, there's other places to put money. The incremental cost of producing a barrel of oil, just like the incremental cost of producing a bushel of wheat or corn, get to be higher. And of course, like agriculture, oil and agriculture are tied at the hip so many ways, but we're based upon the commodity price. We're going to ebb and flow with the price of the commodity.
Well, Ron, thank you for the kind words about my grandfather. We're all very proud of Bud Hanson's service up in the state Senate, up in District 2 and up in Divide County. And thanks also for being the one to announce co-host today, unlike the current host of the show.
Wow. Every time I get roasted for this. I'm sorry I didn't introduce you, Ben.
Chad started the tradition, and I can't stop it. But Ron, I wanted to ask you, in terms of technology, one of the things you said in your op-ed was that unmanned aerial aircraft and 3D seismic technology are assisting in recovery, and it's resulting in fewer exploratory wells. For who aren't in the industry, can you give us like a rough number? How many less exploratory wells, and why is it better that there are less exploratory wells now that this technology is moving that forward?
Well, thank you, Ben. In a conventional oil field, and I'll back up a bit. Today we have roughly about 18,500 wells in North Dakota, producing oil wells. Every single day they're producing oil. That's what generates that 1.25 million barrels of oil a day and almost 3 BCF of gas, which is a huge number of natural gas, liquid-rich natural gas we're producing. So on a conventional field, those wells would cover about 40 acres. In a Bakken field today, those wells cover 2 miles. And then you put multiple wells in those 2 miles. So you think about the environmental footprint, and now we're talking about going 3 miles out. So in that entire 2 miles, you've got basically one 7 to 9 acre pad that might have 2, 4, 8, 14, 16 wells on that pad going out 2 miles this direction, probably going out 2 miles the other direction. So we line all of these Bakken space units. That's what we call the 2 miles directed by the North Dakota Industrial Commission. We had a space unit going north, and we have a space unit going south, all off one pad. Think of the reduced environmental footprint. All your pipelines, these lines are all lined up. The pipelines all follow these corridors. So now you go out another mile. That many less well bores. In a conventional oil field, that entire area would be covered with wells because you're only producing in and around an area of that vertical well. So you think about, that's why you drive through what is now one of the largest oil fields in the world in western North Dakota. It's still farming and ranching. It's farming and ranching with oil development on it, as opposed to what you think of a classical old West Texas oil field that basically there's so many roads and pipelines and wells scattered all over a section of land that you can't really farm and ranch it. Today, we just sit on the edge of those sections and drill out underneath that section and the next section and now the next section. So great question. Unmanned aerial aircraft, all of those things are becoming so critical just in the monitoring and the observation and the technology out on these well pads. Reducing the need to have employees out there every single day is a big part of this. Our workforce challenges in all of North Dakota and all of the industries are not a secret, but the ability to use technology in all those things and just monitoring remotely and having your technicians basically in an office in Tioga or Watford City know which wells need service that day. And it's like, instead of sending a plumber out to every bathroom every day to see if it's okay, you only send them out to the ones that need fixing that day. That's been a game-changing aspect. And safety, of course, as you know, the roadways are always the most dangerous place in any business in any of our lives. So those big advancements have come so far, and every year they just get bigger and bigger.
Well, that's one of the things I think sometimes we think of the oil industry as being so static, or that the public does, not understanding how much better we've gotten about this, both in environmental impacts, land impacts, The efficiency of getting the oil out of the ground, the efficiency of the workforce, the safety, all of it is constantly improving all the time. And it's remarkable, and it's a story that probably doesn't get told enough. I wanted to ask you, though, again, talking about how central the oil and gas industry is to North Dakota's prosperity and economy. I was listening recently to a leader in the ethanol industry deliver some comments kind of warning his industry, which is very much tied to yours, and that the ethanol producers are blending theirs with or maybe not tied to your industry per se, but the fuel industry. They're blending their product in with gasoline, which is of course made from oil. And his warning was, listen, electric vehicles are coming, and when we figure them out and they become more practical, I think for more Americans, it's going to significantly reduce the amount of fuel we're consuming. So that's a risk, obviously, for his industry. It's a risk, obviously, for your industry. How do you see that going? I mean, because simultaneously, we just had Congressman Kelly Armstrong on the other day. He led a congressional delegation to an international climate summit, which I thought, by the way, was great. That, if we're going to have a debate about the climate, people with experience in the energy industry, in the oil industry, people who represent a state that is where the oil industry is very, very important, they should be part of that conversation. But one thing Congressman Armstrong said is, listen, we're going to be using more oil 10 years from now than we are right now. So, kind of mixed messages, but as we continue to move towards, maybe a world where we're using less oil for vehicles and things like that, what does that mean for the industry?
Well, Rob, I hate to disappoint, but I think that the bubble is going to burst quickly on electric vehicles. I'm a supporter.
Sure.
They should have tried to advance hybrid vehicles, because the challenges of infrastructure, the challenges of electrifying so many more aspects of our lives,
Yeah.
and the grid reliability issues, not to mention all of the other issues that individual users of electric vehicles are finding, including insurance costs, by the way. But the reality is, Congressman Armstrong is so correct, because if you look at the percentage of electric vehicles today, it's not even a blip of how many vehicles are on the road. Now, the reality is, we're going to add somewhere around 2 to 3 billion people in this world over the next decade. Guess what? They want to drive, and they want to consume energy. So we need all types of energy. We need ethanol. We need wind. We need everything that we have just to meet the growing demand, not even as individual consumption rises, but just as the population grows. And of course, I like to ask, when I'm giving speeches, I always have people raise their hand. Do you think that Ben's dad used more energy than his grandpa? And does Ben use more energy than his dad? And will Ben's kids use more energy than we do? And the reality is, our children and their children are so connected. They've got a cell phone here. They've got a laptop here. They've got things that run all day long, all energy derivatives, whether they're generated from plastics and oil and gas equivalents, or they're consuming energy, including the web and all of the things that it's taking right now, and how much energy it's consuming. So the world is going to need oil. It may shift a little bit in terms of where and how we need it, but all of the data points.
I think that's really interesting.
Oil is not going to change.
I think that's really interesting, because you're saying we still need wind, we need all these things. I agree. I think the big mistake we make a lot of times in talking about energy is that we think of what monolithic source of energy is going to replace oil, or what monolithic source of energy is it going to be is going to replace gas. And we don't think about how maybe electric vehicles will have some applications, but not all applications, right? Maybe wind powering electric vehicles works in some places, in some use cases, but in other cases it doesn't. I think sometimes we have all these choices, and we make policy trying to direct one source to be the source or the replacement, and really we should just kind of let the market decide what works best where. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think the Biden administration made a catastrophic, poor choice when they decided to move so drastically to electric cars. And basically at the same time thinking you were just going to eliminate coal, oil, natural gas. The reality is a policy in advancing all energy sources would have been better for all of them at the end of the day. And it's putting so much emphasis on the electric car now, and the investment that's been put into that by manufacturers and everybody else, that at scale, every energy source is a challenge. And at scale, to meet the scale of world demand, of you wanting to sit in your house at 30 below at 70 degrees and have a car that runs reliably and affordably, it is an incredible challenge for any energy source to be able to meet that daily demand.
Yeah.
Affordable, reliable, and available. We need it all.
Ron, I wanted to talk to you. Yeah. Well, and Ron, I don't know, couldn't possibly tell what you're talking about with using energy resources, so that I sit and talk to you on my laptop with a lamp on at my desk while looking at my cell phone.
I'm sitting here working on my desktop. I've got my laptop next to me open so I can monitor my email. I've got my Google Home here so that I can listen to music and do other things. I have my smartphone charging next to me. That's the world we live in now.
Rob, I will challenge you to go out and research the amount of consumption that cloud is requiring every day to power. We think about, we plugged it in. No. It's the power that is generating from the cloud to power your machine.
Well, that's why we're starting to see. That's why we're starting to see data centers move into
massive data centers.
Move into North Dakota
areas that produce a lot of heat, produce a lot of CO2. And here's an awkward transition for you. Speaking of CO2, I want to talk to you about CO2 because you had mentioned that we're actually not producing enough right now in North Dakota. We're going to need to be importing it to help supplant and supply the CO2 injections that we're doing in our wells. I'm guessing a lot of folks don't know too much about that, or they might think it's one of those things that sounds funny on the face of it until you get into the details. How much do we produce? How short are we? Where are we going to get the CO2 from if we get to an ideal place?
Ben, we started looking at, actually it was 20 years ago, I went up to EERC with some of my northern tier oil and gas producers who had those wells that were drilled in the 80s and the 90s up in that Kenmare, Botno area up there. And they knew at that time that in order to restore the life of those fields, that we were going to need carbon dioxide into those old aging oil fields in North Dakota. The challenge was they weren't big enough to ever, the size of the prize wasn't worth the cost and all the unknowns to get CO2 up there, even though Basin had that line out of the Dakota gas refinery going up into the Saskatchewan oil field. The difference up in Saskatchewan is the Crown owned all the minerals, so they could make the math work by taking North Dakota CO2 and up into really, supercharging that old Canadian oil field. Now we're doing it in Bowman County with CO2 out of the ground, natural CO2 out of the ground from Wyoming coming into Bowman County. But to your point, once an oil field declines over time. Yesterday was the best day in the life of an oil well because it's a pressure mechanism. So I always say it's like every day you're either going to drill new wells to keep your production up, or else your oil field is going to decline on an individual well basis. But you magnify that over 18,000 wells. It's a huge mountain to keep pushing up, right? You got to drill and complete so many wells a month, and the North Dakota legislators, the policymakers and the appropriators understand that, and that's why we watch how many wells get completed a month. So as time goes by, what we see happening in the Bakken is that your oil production declines and your gas production inclines because you're taking oil out of that reservoir 2 miles deep and allows more gas. Oil is heavier than gas, so it allows the gas to rise up. So what you need to do at some point is you need to supercharge that reservoir. And the Environmental Research Center out of Grand Forks has proven that you can take CO2 and potentially natural gas, inject it into that reservoir. Like currently, historically, we've done it with water in the conventional oil fields in North Dakota, but the Bakken is too tight. The rock is too dense to move water through it. So you're going to use natural gas and CO2 to mobilize that oil off the rock and move it out of move it to the wellbore. Again, best technology today, we get 15 out of every 100 barrels. If we can mobilize that oil and get another 5 or 10, and we get 25 out of every 100 barrels of oil, think about the magnitude, the impacts on North Dakota. So North Dakota's lignite industry and all the commercial sources in North Dakota, we've known this for years, do not generate enough CO2, because when the day is ready and we need CO2 in the Bakken, we're going to need massive amounts of it, maybe 6 to 8 times what we produce in North Dakota that's possible to capture. So that therein lies the great dilemma. Now, are we ever going to be able to build a pipeline through other states to get CO2 here?
That was going to be.
I was going to ask, is it exclusively a pipeline transportation, or are there other options for it?
Yeah, it's really exclusively a pipeline transportation.
I think, I can't imagine trying to put it on train, for instance. I mean, that just seems, I don't think the economics of that seems impractical. So let's talk about that a little bit, because building carbon pipelines has become a very hot issue in our part of the world. Even going down, I mean, you saw it during the presidential campaigns down in Iowa, where, you have a lot of ethanol producers. They're trying, a very big part of the ethanol industry strategy right now to make themselves resilient into the future is to capture that carbon and find places to bury it. I mean, essentially the oil industry would be a customer for the carbon, right? I mean, that's what you're saying. Like,
100%,
beyond just storing it, like, we want to use it. Like, we want to use it to produce our own product, not just necessarily bury it in the ground. I mean, obviously that's still what you're doing, but so how do we get past? I mean, the politics around the carbon pipelines right now seem intractable. How are we going to get these things built?
Well, we've built 20 to 30,000 miles worth of pipeline in Western North Dakota, Rob. So step number one is you've got to do it right. You've got to work with the landowners. You've got to, our companies have made mistakes in the past. We've learned from them. But secondly, there's the political aspects around the carbon credits and all of those things, which are what they are. I always say, the unfortunate part is that it's easy to sit outside of the coal or oil industry and say, well, you shouldn't be doing this or that. But the reality is, and this is a Lynn Helms analogy that I like, if North Dakota's energy is a pie and there's 7 slices, 6 of those slices have to go to consumers outside our state, because we just don't have the population to consume our energy production that we do. So if our consumers outside the state want energy that has a different carbon intensity, or they demand that it obviously is produced in the most environmentally friendly way, even though I think our advancements in the last decade have been incredible in terms of emission reductions. But we've got to be able to give them the product they want, or they're going to go somewhere else for their commodity. So, we've got to try and unfortunately, that's a consumer-driven component of all of this. And I think, we got to get back to the safety of a carbon pipeline. I'm not in the carbon pipeline business, although I have asked for a special discussion to educate me later this month on carbon pipelines and on the issue related to safety. I think that there's a lot of misinformation about the safety of carbon pipelines, so that has to be step one. You got to get the actual facts out in front of all of the stakeholders to know that this is safe. This is where the distance is, et cetera, et cetera. We've got trains coming through our communities. We've got massive pipelines carrying many other commodities through our communities. But we have to know that we can stand up and talk about the safety of this. And I'm not doing it until I fully understand it. So that's one. And obviously, you gotta find a way to. This is a potential commodity in North Dakota. You got to find a way to make it work for all of the landowners, the surface owners, the pore space owners.
Yeah.
We've kind of been bystanders in all of this. Frankly, it's not our pipeline, it's for us. I think when the technology and the economics are right, we're going to need CO2. And obviously we would be a potential customer of this pipeline for decades and decades to come, or another one.
I want to be, sorry, Ben, I don't mean to jump in front of you, but I just want, because I want to be very clear. How important is the ability, and I mean, some of the pipelines being debated now are not for the oil industry, like the Summit Carbon Pipeline. That's for the ethanol industry. They're bringing it here to store it. The oil industry really doesn't have anything to do with that, but it does speak to a larger debate about that type of infrastructure. So how important is our ability to transport carbon into North Dakota for use by the oil industry? How important is that to the oil industry's future in our state?
I would say it's absolutely critical, and we're doing it today. We're moving it from North Dakota into Canada. 20 years of that pipeline. We're bringing it from Wyoming into Montana and into Bowman County, North Dakota already. So we have been doing it, and we are doing it. And I think the fundamental challenges that are resulting from this now are more about energy policy and about storage and I think there's been broad-based support for the realization that utilizing it for enhanced oil recovery is a mechanism of technology of functions, I think. So there's a leap from storage to utilization, but even our folks, I think our gas plants, we've got nearly 30 natural gas processing plants, and the pressure on them, or the pressure on the value added type facilities that you're going to see across North Dakota for carbon injection and storage in and around their facilities, like you're seeing at Red Trail, are likely going to be realities in the very near future, because the pressure on them from banks and financing and everywhere else, and emission reductions from EPA is coming. It's so significantly punitive that you're going to have to find a way to reduce your carbon intensity and your footprint.
Well, I think we'll.
Ron, I want to.
Well, I'm sorry, Ben. Go right ahead.
Oh, no, Ron. I'm just going to leave off with a quick question. When I was studying up for the interview today, I was looking at the announcement back in September that the U.S. is producing about 13.2 million barrels of oil per day, and that North Dakota is contributing about 1.2 million to that. I did the math, and that's roughly 9% of the nation's oil output, when we're clearly not 9% of the nation's population. And I'm guessing that there are a lot of folks even in North Dakota that don't do those kind of things. You yourself were here talking about trying to study up on carbon pipelines. For someone who's listening to this and going, these guys are so in the weeds, I don't know the first thing, or I don't understand this stuff with the energy industry. Where does a person go? Where does a North Dakotan go to educate themselves or try and get familiarized with what we're talking about?
Well, one of the North Dakota's Department of Mineral Resources probably has the best website of any regulatory agency, but you can find the data on the North Dakota Industrial Commission, Department of Mineral Resources websites. And then the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation website has a lot of information and a lot of links in those things. But Ben, you're exactly right. We're about 9% of the nation's production today. We were 13%. The Permian Basin in Texas and now New Mexico has just essentially gone off the charts in productivity, which has been great for all of us as consumers, because we've directly benefited as a result of what's happened in Texas. I think the incredible production increases that they've seen out there, despite the federal policies that's on private land in Texas and now into New Mexico. So, but in terms of North Dakota's production, I think what I'm focusing on is trying to keep production above 1 million barrels a day for the next 2 decades. Rob, that is game changing from a standpoint of I'm not talking about oil and gas. I'm talking about our kids and their kids and other kids to be able to live here and affordably afford to live here, and jobs and opportunities. We've shown that if you create the opportunity, people will come, and all you have to do is go to any town west of in western North Dakota, and you realize quickly, wow, what has happened in Watford City and Ray and Tioga and all the derivatives. Now we got to move. We also have to move to some value-added opportunities to advance that for the 3 or 4 decades after that, and that's part of why I was one of the key components of the Legacy Fund.
I was just going to say, I mean,
use that money.
Just the one facet. If we're producing 1 million barrels a day going in the next 2 decades, just the amount of money that puts in the Legacy Fund, and then turning the Legacy Fund into its own source of revenue, the interest it kicks off. the things that we could do about it, although we're still having debates about what we're doing with the legacy fund. That's a whole other podcast that we could have. But you're right. I mean, game changing, I guess, is the cliche, but I mean, that's the way to put it. It's profound, the impact it could have on North Dakota.
Rob, the thing that we're beginning to forget in North Dakota is that the 1970s and 80s and early 90s in the state, I always say I came out of a town of 120 people in rural North Dakota. I was one of the out of a class at NDSU in 1988. I was one of very few that was just fortunate to find a job in North Dakota. All my friends and classmates, some of them took over the farms because that was just a generational timing thing. But so many fewer kids stay on the farm today. So many fewer kids. And in those days, there were no jobs. They all went to Denver, Minneapolis, wherever. That's not the case today.
Yeah.
But we are not that far as a state. If we can't take this legacy fund and recognize that we're putting this aside for our kids and grandkids to ensure that we don't get taxed out of the ability to live here and the ability to, have jobs that attract us here, and it's a lot easier to keep sons and daughters at home on a farm in western North Dakota when they've got additional revenue, whether it be from oil and natural gas production or now potentially pore space values or land values or just better jobs. So it's not that long ago that was simply not the case, and I'm very concerned that we forget where we've come from, because things can change so fast in a state as that agriculture really is a commodity state.
You're right. I have written and worried about the legacy fund, that it's a big pot of money sitting there, and I get afraid that we're going to do something that is not very visionary, that is not very forward thinking of it. That's my concern of it, is that it's a moral hazard. But we'll have to discuss that on another episode. Ron, Ron, thank you so much for joining.
Hey, thank you.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, just finished up our interview with Ron Ness, who represents what is, I think, the thing is, I don't like to say, the oil industry is the most important industry in our state. Listen, every industry, every company that is operating in North Dakota is important. Every single one. I want people to come to North Dakota and live here and love North Dakota and do their business, but there's just no ignoring the outsized impact that industry has on our state budget, on our state economy, on our prosperity, all the opportunities that it creates. It is enormous and it is undeniable. And I really think the most interesting part of that interview for me was the stuff about the carbon pipeline. I think understanding that North Dakota, because I think sometimes we're having that debate in the context of the Summit pipeline, and I hear a lot of people.
We're having the debate in the context of carbon capture, which is separate. It's different. It's related, but it is separate.
Yeah, I mean, because you have the carbon capture part, and then you have the carbon storage part, and then you have even the third part that he was talking about, which is carbon utilization, where it's like we're capturing the carbon, and then we're bringing it somewhere so we can use it for something else. And they're still kind of storing it, right? I mean, they're putting it down under the ground, and it's pushing oil back up. It's a very crude way of saying it, but they're putting the carbon gas down, they're pushing the oil back up, and the gas stays down there. So we're taking carbon that we emitted, we're putting it back in the ground, and we're pushing out oil, which is a product. I mean, to me, I look at this as a good thing. But a lot of the debate, where it's gotten really hot over the last year or so, has been about the Summit carbon pipeline. And that's been all about, it's at the ethanol industry bringing their carbon from other states and just dumping it in North Dakota. I think a part of that, not realizing, North Dakota industry has a need for the carbon. Like, where it could be, not just a place to store it, a place where we could use it to also help North Dakota industries produce their product. I think, to me, I haven't heard a lot about that in the debate. I think that's very interesting.
I wonder how many people know, including people, directly around those areas in North Dakota that are oil producing, that North Dakota actually doesn't produce enough carbon per what the industry is going to need. and we're going to be importing some. And I'd love to know where we're going to import them from. I'm guessing they don't know the answer, but that kind of devil's in the details is going to be, coming up pretty fast if we want to keep things like the Bakken Formation and Three Forks shales alive, like Ron's talking about.
Well, even absent, I mean, because again, the Summit Carbon Express, like that pipeline, has the way it's structured now. Their business plan has nothing to do with the oil industry right now. The thing is they're already wanting to bring the carbon to North Dakota just to bury it in the ground. The fact that we could go the additional step, I mean, that speaks to there are opportunities out there for other products to bring carbon that, I mean, maybe with our own coal industry, right? I mean, we have, or our own ethanol industry where we have, the Coal Creek Station and some of these coal plants where maybe we could capture the carbon there and give it to the oil industry. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in these industries, but it seems like we produce so much carbon, and we want to produce less. The fact that we could use it in this way and sell it to a customer, like that incentivizes the reason to capture it and to bring it here. That seems like a really big deal. That seems like a very positive thing.
Huge deal for our industry. And again, we're producing 9% of the nation's oil output when we are in North Dakota less than 1% of the nation's population. And now there are plenty of states that punch above their weight class population per whatever industry they're in, but that is stark.
Oh yeah, I mean we punch above our like in corn production too. I mean lots of things, but yeah, that's such an interesting topic. I mean, the fact that North Dakota has a carbon
I will
shortage.
say we announced an all-time record, the all-time high, 18,000 wells. Well, technically 18,600 and change wells, and then 1.24 million barrels per day in October. That was our all-time record. And I always do get a kick out of most of the Bakken explosion happened due to new technology in horizontal drilling. But I always do laugh. That happened during the Obama administration. Now the new record's being set, and the most oil's ever been drilled during the Biden administration. My point there is I don't think there's maybe quite as much tie-in to who's president of the United States versus where industries, innovations, technology, and where market demand comes from.
I always like to remind my Democratic friends that the economic recovery post the financial crash of 2008. A lot of the economic recovery that happened under the Obama administration, although they don't like to talk about it very much, was driven by the shale oil and gas revolution, not just in North Dakota, but places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Texas, really added a lot of jobs and created a lot of prosperity at a time when our country really, really needed it. I mean, that's why North Dakota became such an epicenter for people wanting to come from all over the country. It wasn't just that we had lots and lots of jobs available here. It was also they were losing their jobs where they were. Anyway, that's a whole other.
And the longevity is fascinating to me too of the oil play in North Dakota, because if you're doing 1.2 and change barrels per day, they're still looking at 3.3 billion. Then some of the folks in the industry were speculating up to 10 billion barrels from just North Dakota.
Yeah.
In the future.
It's amazing.
That's a 30, 40-year play. I mean, the long-term planning for this long-term, I think, would become.
I remember back when the oil boom started, and we were talking about the whole thing, the whole shebang, maybe lasting 30 years. Now we're talking about another 30 or 40 years from now, and we're already like 20 years in. So, pretty amazing what's happening there. Let's switch gears. Let's talk about Donald Trump and Doug Burgum. I mean, it's made lots of headlines. So Doug Burgum endorsed Donald Trump right before the Iowa caucuses. Trump then dominated in the Iowa caucuses, which was pretty much expected. Not what I wanted, but was what happened and what I expected to happen. And then during his victory speech, with Doug Burgum standing on stage with him, Donald Trump turns to him and says, "Oh, he's one of the best governors in America." Thanked him for the endorsement. Suggested Burgum, I thought this was kind of funny, suggested that Burgum might have gotten further with his own presidential campaign had he been more controversial, which I thought was kind of funny coming from Trump himself.
The weird damning with faint praise and the weird Trump speak things. He's too good. he's too good and not controversial, and that's why he didn't get farther.
Yeah.
It's like,
But then,
so if he'd been worse,
but then
more controversial.
Right. But then the thing that started the most chin wagging was him talking about, him hoping that, Trump hoping that Doug would be a very important part of his administration, which has set off.
I'm going to call him to help him to be part of the administration. It was not, I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, it was a hint. No, it wasn't a hint. It was directly saying,
right,
I want him in the admin. I'm going to call him.
Right.
Now, what Trump says versus what he does, right. It wasn't a hint.
I mean,
it was directly stating.
We need to preface all this by saying that Donald Trump says a lot of things he doesn't mean. And this could have just been a case of Doug Burgum was just the most recent person to flatter him. I mean, Doug was the only of the presidential rivals. I mean, Burgum managed to endorse Trump before Vivek Ramaswamy did. Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a Trump fanboy, it wouldn't surprise me if he has a Trump tattoo somewhere on his body, and somehow Burgum got out in front of him in endorsing Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Trump clearly really appreciated. Maybe this was just Trump, lavishing praise on the last person to flatter him. I don't know. If we take it at face,
I think it's worth noting. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's worth noting. Doug Burgum was the only other elected official on stage, right? Past or present.
I would have to go back and look at the stage again. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure, and there were multiple U.S. senators and some congressmen in that audience, but for some reason, Doug Burgum was the one they invited up on stage. Something to turn.
There's something to that
within the Burgum world.
There's something to
something that. Clearly has changed where there's a lot of aggressive messaging right now. Doug is working the cable news circuit. He's making posts about supporting Donald Trump in Iowa.
Yeah, he's gonna be a surrogate.
Donald Trump doesn't need it.
Yeah. I mean,
he doesn't need it. He's going to win anyway.
But Burgum has is now seems to be positioning himself to be an important Trump surrogate, and a lot of times those surrogates are who get picked to be cabinet officials or even vice president. Now, April Baumgarten, my colleague, has an article up in our forum newspapers today that you should go read, where she asked Doug, hey, you said this was a person you wouldn't do business with in the past. Now, you're endorsing him for president, and there's talk about you joining his cabinet, et cetera, maybe even being vice president. And he's saying he wouldn't rule out a cabinet position. He's saying he wouldn't rule out some of this stuff. Like, he's not saying no to it, even though he said no in the past, that he's not interested in those things. He's not saying no now. And I think that's really interesting. Listen, I'm on the outside. I clearly don't like the Trump administration, so that's the lens through which I see anything. I don't see how that benefits Doug Burgum being, joining the Trump administration. I think just setting everything else aside, politically speaking, for somebody like Burgum, who I still think has ambitions for 2028, I just think that would be a bad move. But maybe Burgum's thinking, maybe he's reevaluated and said, maybe Secretary of Energy is my high watermark. Maybe Vice President is as far as I can go, and that's still pretty good. I'll sign up for that gig if it's offered.
Well, and I understand you're trying to, when you're running for the nomination, which he was up until, whenever. He was running for the nomination for December. 6 months.
Yeah.
You say a lot of things, you might do a lot of things that you then go back on or turn around on, but Burgum really put his foot down rhetorically about not wanting to be it just in the admin, a cabinet secretary, an ambassador. He went out of his way to say he's an executive. That's why he wouldn't ever run for the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate, because he doesn't want to be one of 100 or one of 435 or one of a cabinet members. He's an executive. He's a CEO. That's his private sector experience. That is his only government experience, as being a governor of his home state. So if he did a 180 on that, I guess there are really no consequences if the Burgum or
he's hardly
Trump
the first one.
He's
hardly the first one if he does that 180, and I don't think people are going to hold it against him. I kind of do, but the other thing,
it would be disappointing, and I don't necessarily know how, to your point, to your column, it almost feels like he's trying to do both at once, straddle the line and see if he can run for a third term or become an administration official. And you wrote a pretty strongly worded column about that he needs to kind of fess up one way or another if that is what he's doing.
I don't think it's fair to North. If he's thinking I'm going to be in the Trump cabinet, or because obviously there's two different timelines. Like if it's vice president, that decision is going to come within the next couple of months, right? Trump's going to have to name a running mate. The cabinet thing's not going to happen until after the election, where he starts appointing cabinet members. So if I'm Doug Burgum, one comes faster than the other, but I mean, if he runs for governor, I think he needs to know that he's going to run and complete 4 years. I think North Dakotans deserve somebody who is focused on Bismarck and not Washington, D.C. So whatever his national aspirations are, he needs to be upfront with us, because I don't want a thing where he runs on the ticket and then he immediately leaves, and now we have Lieutenant Governor Tammy Miller, I would assume, would be our governor without really having been at the top of the ticket. I don't think that would be fair to North Dakota voters.
Gaming this out right now, for folks who have names, have some means, and have stated or hinted that they want this job, Kelly Armstrong is pretty clearly not running against Doug Burgum and has said as such, and I take him at his word there. I still think he'd have room to switch to governor if Doug officially announced he just wasn't doing it again, and there might be an interesting Tammy Miller, Kelly Armstrong move there. Former state senator Tom Campbell very clearly has made some, I would call them extremely critical by North Dakota standards, remarks about Doug Burgum. Does this approach that Burgum's making towards Donald Trump shore up his support on the right or MAGA side of the party for the convention and for the primary, so that Tom Campbell doesn't have room to breathe? Could that be an explanation for it?
Oh, sure.
That might be too clever by half.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, if anything, I mean, that's what I thought. That's precisely what I thought he was doing before all this cabinet talk started, before Trump. I mean, in that period between when Burgum endorsed and when Trump started talking about him being maybe in the administration, that's exactly what I thought. Is Burgum's running for a third term. This is him inoculating himself against the far populist right. Well, I mean, let's face it. I keep calling them the far populist right, against the establishment in the North Dakota Republican Party, because let's face it, the Trumpies control the state party. They control the national party. They're the establishment now. The normies are, I don't know what you want to call them, the insurgents or whatever. They're not the establishment anymore. So, Doug, it's, inoculating himself against the establishment.
I mean, it would make some kind of sense to me. I mean, considering how he won his primary against a 20-year sitting attorney general in order to become the governor, it's actually not quite analogous, but it's not completely different either.
I think it makes it harder for anybody to get to his right.
Yes, which is what he needs in order to get the nomination. Frankly, in North Dakota, that's pretty much all you need in order. I don't think he had to endorse Trump. I think endorsing Trump just made things a lot easier. I think it probably knocked down some obstacles or some potential headaches. I think he could have secured the nomination and been elected to a third term as governor without ever endorsing Donald Trump. I don't think that's something he had to do, but I think he did do it for a lot of reasons. One of the things that was kind of interesting is in April's article, she asked him, and one of the things he said is that he did it for the good of North Dakota. So when I read April's article, I'm not seeing anywhere in there where Doug Burgum really says, although I'm sure he would say these things if he asked, and certainly he said these things when he endorsed Donald Trump. But in that article, when he's asked, well, why did you do this when you said in the past you wouldn't do business with him? He's basically saying, well, I did it for the good of North Dakota. And that speaks to something that I wrote. All these Republicans getting in line, I'm saying they're doing it out of fear, and part of it's the fear of their political careers. But also, I think part of it is fear for, what does it mean for their state? So let's say Governor Burgum does run for a third term. And as every governor in North Dakota does routinely, when there's a drought or there's a flood or something, a tornado, they declare an emergency. And then they need the president to sign off on that to release federal funds and to help with the response to whatever it is. How likely if Doug Burgum refuses to endorse Donald Trump, does anyone think that Donald Trump would be above punishing North Dakota by withholding
a disaster declaration or withholding federal funds to make our state bleed to punish Doug Burgum?
I think it would only depend on if he was paying attention to that level of detail of government functionality. And it's a great example you bring up.
I think Donald Trump absolutely. I think Donald Trump would be. I don't think that Trump cares about the granular level of government, but I think Trump is not above saying, I want to stick it to Doug Burgum, who didn't endorse me. How are we going to do that? And then landing on something like that.
If he has competent enough administrators to find those things out, but I mean, who wants to be at risk of that? Now, this is all hypothetical, but it is a great example of checks and balances written into the system that one thought was assumed, like electors voting for the who the people in their state voted for, or abiding by our elections, that have come into question in the modern era, very unfortunately. If that were all to happen, I would say at that point, and it's almost too, well, it's not going to happen because Doug did endorse him and he's very strongly endorsing him. If that were to happen, that is a very stark contrast with Trump's eventual fall opponent, Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's Republican and Democratic predecessors, who all signed things like national disaster reliefs.
Any other
governors and states, no matter what
any other president, like I couldn't imagine any Republican president prior to Donald Trump trying to stick it to Massachusetts over a hurricane disaster because they don't like the governor.
No,
I can't imagine.
I've never heard of him doing. He was the last Republican president. I never heard of him doing any such thing.
I don't think Bill Clinton. I don't think Barack Obama. I don't think any of them would have done that. I just don't think that was games that those guys would play. I think Trump would. I think Trump absolutely would. The other thing is Doug considers this is, I mean, if I was Doug Burgum and I was thinking, well, do I want to serve in a Trump administration? I might think about that noose and I wrote a column about this morning. I might think about that noose that January 6th insurrectionists set up for Mike Pence outside of Congress. I might think about the way that Donald Trump talks about Mike Pence now, or talked about Mike Pence then when he was sicking his mob on him. I would think about what Mike Pence says now, right? I mean, what Mike Pence, this is a quote from Mike Pence, said, "The American people deserve to know that President Trump asked me to put him over my oath to the Constitution. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States." Former Trump attorney, I want to run through some quotes here because, again, if you're thinking about joining this administration, here's what former administration members in the Trump administration have said. This is former Attorney General Bill Barr, someone who engaged in that kind of, talking about Trump, someone who engaged in that kind of bullying about a process that is fundamental to our system and to our self-government shouldn't be anywhere near the Oval Office. Here's former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. Here's Mark Esper, another former Secretary of Defense. I think he's unfit for office. He puts himself before the country. His actions are all about him and not about the country. And then, of course, I believe he has the integrity and character issues as well. Here's former General Mark Miley, who served as chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator. We take an oath to the Constitution, and we take an oath to the idea that is America, and we're willing to die to protect it. Rex Tillerson, former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, said that Trump's understanding of global events, his understanding of global history, his understanding of U.S. history was really limited. It's really hard to have a conversation with someone who doesn't even understand the concept for why we're talking about this. H.R. McMaster, who was National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, said, "We saw the absence of leadership, really anti-leadership, and what that can do to our country." John Bolton, who's also a national security advisor, said, "I believe foreign leaders think he is a laughing fool." John Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, says Trump is a person who has nothing but contempt for our democratic institutions, our Constitution, and the rule of law. There is nothing more than that can be said. God help us. Another chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, said, "I quit." He resigned, by the way, after January 6th. He said, "I quit because I think he failed at being the president when he needed him to be that." Anthony Scaramucci, who was a communications director for Donald Trump at one time, said he is the domestic terrorist of the 21st century. Another communications director, Stephanie Grisham, said, I am terrified of him running in 2024. Betsy DeVos, former Secretary of Education, who resigned after January 6th, she said, I quote, when I saw what was happening on January 6th and didn't see the president step in and do what he could have done to turn it back or slow it down or really address the situation, it was just obvious to me that I couldn't continue. Now, I could go on. If you want to read this whole list, I know I kind of bored, but I think when you start putting all those quotes together, those are people Trump hired. Those are people he chose to be in his administration. And that's what they say about him now.
Governor Burgum and other vice presidential aspirants, Kristi Noem of South Dakota has been spoken about frequently, among others, to try. There's that one candidate from Arizona. I never remember her name. I think she lost.
Kari Lake.
Yeah, Kari Lake. They're frequently talked about. You know, as someone who's ran for office before, certainly never in this high capacity, but has talked to many others who have ran for office, you get into this kind of fishbowl world where everything's 20 feet in front of you. You're going to these events, everything's very political. You're not seeing non-political people, and you kind of get a little bit of a candidate brain going, and it's almost just human nature. But I wonder, when looking at all these opportunities or what they think they could do, maybe in Burgum's case, he thinks he can move the administration to a better, more detailed or centrist place with his presence there. I wonder, if you sat him down outside of it and have him kind of, I don't know a better term besides sober up a little, or just like have a clear light of day show on this and say, do you want to be where Mike Pence is 4 years after this administration? I guarantee you, no matter who's aspiring to be the vice president under Donald Trump, and this is all, by the way, assuming Donald Trump gets elected, which is not anywhere near a guarantee, but if he was, do you want to wind up where Mike Pence wound up? Right. I can't think of any ambitious political person who would want to do that, whether they like Trump or not.
I've gotten so many texts from people talking about, asking me, do you think Trump, do you think Burgum would accept, is he going to be a cabinet member? I mean, any other governor of North Dakota who could potentially be a cabinet secretary or potentially be the vice president, I would think, that'd be great, right? I mean, it's absolutely something you should consider.
Well, we had that. Ed Schaefer was the Secretary of Agriculture under George W. Bush for obvious reasons.
Exactly. I mean, that's something that you should accept. I mean, that would be a big deal. Right? I mean, first of all, you're serving your country at a very high level, and the opportunity to be on the national stage and have a North Dakotan up there, I would be proud in any other context. But the thing I keep reminding people, who are doing all the analysis of this is not a normal candidate, and this is not a normal election year. I think that has to enter in the calculus. If you're saying should he or shouldn't he, my advice was no. Why on earth would you want to sign up for that? When you look at the number of former Trump administration who have been burned by him, who now say that he's unfit for office, and some of whom, by the way, are also under criminal indictment. If that's what you want to sign up for, I go for it, I guess. But is the juice worth the squeeze, Doug, to say that you were vice president for a while?
I would imagine someone with.
Nope. Did we lose Ben? We may have lost Ben here for a moment.
Oh, I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I would imagine someone with, again, Burgum's executive experience, and I take him at his word that he does not want to be one of 100 or one of 435 members of the U.S. House. Being inside of a Trump cabinet and the lack of autonomy that comes with it. I mean, never mind Donald Trump, actually. If you're a cabinet secretary, it's one of those jobs where people think they're going to have a lot of control or get to do a lot, and they get there and realize that they control very, very little. And to what I've seen with the Trump administration, if you were to have another one of those, you will also be in charge or be in control of very little.
I mean, with Trump, it can go both ways. Because, with Donald Trump, it's like down. Yeah, I think with Donald Trump, I think most of the time, maybe he's not going to care so much, right? Like if it's just Donald Trump, I think on most days is not going to care what the Department of Transportation does. He doesn't care about the granular details of government in that way. But the problem is there's always the chance that he could start to care. Like some turn of political events, he wants to screw somebody who insulted him politically, or he wants to stick it to a state he doesn't like. Something happens, and then he comes to you, and all of a sudden, where he didn't care before, now he super cares. Now he's up in your business, and now he's asking you maybe to do something unconstitutional, like he asked Mike Pence to overturn the 2020 election. He comes to you and he asks you to do that, and your choices are go along with it, or face what Mike Pence faced, which is Trump supporters building a gallows for you as they violently assault Congress. Is that what you want to sign up for? Because I wouldn't want to sign up for
in normal times. Yeah, in normal times, Rob, you writing a column that's saying "Remember the noose" would be interpreted as a metaphor, and that's what I thought it was when I first read it. When I read the headline, I started reading the column, and I was like, "Oh no, there was a literal noose there. It's an actual noose he's writing about."
Right.
Wow.
Remember the picture.
Are.
Yeah, that's where we are as a country. They built a gallows for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
So speaking of the hypothetical, sorry to trample on you. Oh, good.
No, Ben and I have a little bit of a lag, I think, in our connection here, which is why we keep talking over each other. Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say, I know we got to wrap up here, but real quick, we also don't know, because Doug Burgum has not officially announced whether he's running for governor or not. Do we know who all of the incumbents are going to the Republican convention? Is there tension there? I don't think we've heard announced one way or another.
There is tension. There's nothing that I've had conversations with statewide officials. I don't know that anybody's made a decision about whether or not they'll go to the state convention. Obviously, Governor Burgum hasn't decided if he's going to seek a third term or not. And then once he makes that decision, if he is, seeking a third term, whether or not he would go to the NDGOP state convention. And the reason why that's a question is there is a gap, let's say politically, from where a lot of our statewide election officials are to where the state political party is. And there's a feeling that a lot of them are going to go there and they're going to get booed, or they're going to get, embarrassed by kind of the populist wing of the party. Would they want to show up? It's hard to say, because on one hand, it's such an unprecedented situation where you have elected officials who are kind of feeling estranged from their own political party. So that's interesting. But the other part of it is, I could also see them falling in line. Look at how many, at the national level, look at how many people who were pretty Trump skeptical, just kind of falling in line behind Donald Trump. So I think it could go either way. You could either see a rebellion where a lot of the statewides don't want to show up and instead just run straight to the June primary, or you could see a lot of them fall in line because, again, the Trump movement and the populist wing of the party is, they're ascendant.
I am going to be fascinated to see how many challenges we get out of this year. We haven't seen any announced yet, but by the time the convention rolls around,
right,
there's got to be something, right? There's got to be somebody challenging the incumbents, or saying they're not conservative enough, or they're not pure enough. I got to think that's coming, given what's been going on with the state party. I think it's fascinating that for the first time in my memory, the North Dakota Republicans and the North Dakota Democrats are having their convention same weekend and in the same city.
I know.
And if someone doesn't take advantage of that and do some kind of a unity event, or you, Rob, as a columnist, or some reporter doesn't do some Hanna-Barbera, like running back and forth through the convention hall, missed opportunity.
I'm annoyed.
You got to go to both.
I'm annoyed by it, because I want to attend both and I want to cover both fulsomely. And it's, without being in the room, it's hard to know when to be there, right? You can look at, you can look at the agenda, but sometimes stuff just happens. And if you're not there to cover it, I will tell you, the parties can hold their conventions whenever they want. I will tell you that as somebody who is interested in covering both, I am very annoyed by it. I'm glad they're at least both in the same city, but
I think it'll be fascinating. I hope something comes out of it, and something, I don't know. A lot of folks don't know how these things work or what happens. So I hope otherwise, knowledgeable people in Fargo who don't necessarily know how the conventions work, I hope they're able to learn or see something of it. I hope something comes out of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening. Coming up on Friday, who do we have coming up on Friday? Let me look at my calendar because I'm forgetting. We have Aaron Moss from the North Dakota Fraternal Order of Police. State Representative Nico Rios continues to be in office despite berating 2 law enforcement officers with bigoted and homophobic comments. It's remarkable. The leaders of the North Dakota Republican Party called for Representative Rios to resign. He's ignored their calls, and then Chairwoman Sandy Sanford flip-flopped on her call. So, I think this continues to be an important issue. I mean, there's got to be a lot of law enforcement officers who are looking at the Republican majority in North Dakota saying, I thought you guys backed the blue. Maybe not so much. So, Aaron Moss from the North Dakota Fraternal Order of Police is going to be on, and we're going to talk about that. So, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.